It takes a very quick glance at my content to realize that I have consumed a metric ton of media. And while I typically talk about movies and games on this channel, one aspect of media that is equally important to me is shows. I grew up watching Nickelodeon, Disney, and on the rare occasion Cartoon Network, and when I became older, my love for shows stayed with me. And one thing I've noticed now that I'm old as hell is that some shows do not know when to end their show. So often in media, this exact thing happens. The first season of a show will become immensely popular. They pump out more seasons to make more money. To continue the story for the fans, ultimately making seasons of shows that are not as good as the first couple seasons, thus butchering the series as a whole and making it difficult to recommend to friends. And today we're going to take a look at a few examples of shows that knew when they needed to end and a few that didn't, and then tie those into a larger idea of when any show should stop production. Also, for the sake of argument, I'm going to take the quality of the respective shows relatively out of the equation, and I think that will be explained as you watch more. And hopefully we can answer the question, when should a show end? The first show I want to highlight is the critically acclaimed television drama Breaking Bad. And real quick, I'm going to flash a spoiler warning for these shows, and I highly recommend you watch all of them all the way through, as I will be spoiling these stories and endings of these shows. Unless you don't care about spoilers, in which case we can just continue. The story of Breaking Bad follows Walter White and his interactions with the drug world, as he is a master chemist recently diagnosed with cancer. One of the main drives of the show is the evolution of Walter's character, and it is one of the most interesting parts of the show. Walter starts as a relatively moral person and grows into a ruthless drug lord towards the end. And with that being a main focus, the show was built around it, putting Walter in increasingly bad situations and showing how callous he's becoming. His character development is one of, if not the most important parts of the show. Starting off, he wants to make money for his family, as his survival rates at the hand of cancer are not looking so good. But towards the end, it is very clear that he's becoming more money hungry beyond the point of it being for his family. Another big aspect of the show, and specifically the first couple seasons, is that Walter never really receives serious punishment for his actions. Do people around him get hurt as a direct consequence of his actions? Of course they do. But Walter and his family are relatively fine in these seasons, and Walt is being paid incredibly, so it's more of a benefit for him to go deeper into the rabbit hole. So why is the 5th season of Breaking Bad the perfect ending? The finale of the 4th season, titled Face Off, is also commonly regarded as an amazing ending, so why am I praising the show for making a 5th season? And that is because the majority of the setups that I talked about in the first 4 seasons are not paid off by Face Off. And these are payoffs that are necessary for the show to finally rest. First is to show that Walter has gone way too far. He's obviously really greedy in the 4th season, but the 5th highlights his greed and power complex even more, showing how irredeemable he really is and showing that an end to Walter's regime is necessary for the show to conclude. And following that point is the punishment section of season 5. As stated, Walt and his family are never severely punished for Walt's actions, and as Walt's choices get more and more greedy and sadistic, the show needed to express some serious ramifications. It wouldn't be enough to just kill someone off, they do plenty of that in this show. There needed to be significant upsets to Walt and his family for the ending to feel justified. And that's what the 5th season is for, and why it's such a phenomenal ending for the show. Walt's family life is destroyed. Something so pivotal to the plot up until this point, his interactions with Skyler and Walt Jr., is finally paid off in tragedy. Additionally, smaller setups like the massive amount of money Walt has accrued is also paid off in the final season. And the biggest one is the death of Walter. The possibility of death in the Breaking Bad universe is massive. Probably the majority of characters we meet die by the end. So Walter dying was a possibility in all 5 seasons. But it had to happen in the 5th season in order to show his gradual decline and inevitable demise. And I'm not saying this just because the 5th season is really good. Even if the final season of Breaking Bad was complete and utter garbage, I would still probably call this show a great example of when to end a show, because everything they set up needed to be paid off, and that was not done in the first 4 seasons, so a 5th season was necessary. Every character, from the major players to the lesser important ones, have a payoff in one way or another. Every major plot point that didn't end in the 4th season needed to have an end, and like I said, Walter's character development is a major player in this. It wouldn't be satisfying to watch Walter die in the first to third seasons because it's very unlikely you can change a character to a point of no return in that amount of time like they do with Walter in Breaking Bad. So it's for that reason that Breaking Bad had to end at the 5th season. That's when Walt's story is complete, and that's how the show should end. Now, going away from drama, The Simpsons is an example of when a show maybe should have ended way earlier than it did. I'll be frank, I have not watched all 36 seasons of The Simpsons, nor am I for this video, but going off what I have seen and what I've heard other people say about the show, here's my analysis. As stated, The Simpsons has 36 seasons. It is the longest running American animated sitcom and has garnered both a good and bad reputation in different areas. Now, as a show with no major overarching storylines like we talked about in Breaking Bad, an argument could be formed that states that The Simpsons never needs to end. It's comedy, so just keep writing more jokes, keep pumping out episodes, and you're good. So this is an interesting case, where unlike Breaking Bad, the show is episodic. You don't necessarily need to see the previous episode to understand what's going on in this one. So when should The Simpsons end? Should it have ended after a few seasons, or should they make 65 more, make it an even 100? And this answer will vary greatly depending on who you ask. Now, I know I said I was taking quality out of the argument, but this is a little interesting. Going off a Rotten Tomatoes score, which I know isn't always the best telling of how good something is, but you can see a noticeable drop off in scores around season 11 and beyond, which, if you're a numbers person, is the majority of the show. Instead of being in the 90s, it's more in the 80s, and following seasons will drop even lower into 70s and 60s territory. So if we're going purely on hindsight and using ratings as our benchmark, the show should have ended after season 10, as that is when the scores decline after that. But the people who just like The Simpsons for the dumb fun of it and the comedy might say that the show should go on forever. So The Simpsons is an interesting case. Should the show end when quality starts to decline, or should they keep going and hope viewers will enjoy it more? And quite honestly, I don't know. Personally, I don't enjoy a comedy show if the jokes are bad, because that's literally the one thing they have to do to keep me entertained. So I might lean towards the stance that the show should have ended at season 10. But with a show like this, it's anyone's personal preference. All of this isn't even factoring in the fact that comedy is subjective. So while season 26 is sitting around at 75% for both critics and audience, that could be someone's favorite season. They may want 10 more seasons just like this. Because there are no major plot points that need to be followed up and paid off, The Simpsons could either end today or never. We may never know, and it's tough to put a definitive answer to it. But why I'm factoring in audience and critic scores for this show as opposed to the rest is that if a lot of people don't like a comedy, it can be very difficult for a show to continue and survive. A driving factor for a show like this on whether it will continue or not is audience numbers. And if no one's watching because the quality has fallen way short of what they're expecting, then the show will struggle to keep going. So should The Simpsons have ended on a high note? Maybe, but also it might be too big to fail, to the point where it may never have an end, or at least not one for a while. And ending a series like this can be very difficult, because without huge plot points, how can a show properly end? But let's move on for now to our next example. Going back to drama series is the Netflix original that made Netflix originals cool again, Stranger Things. This one has a more definitive answer as to when it should or shouldn't have ended than The Simpsons, I swear. Stranger Things is a prime example of a show going on way longer than it needed to. The first season of Stranger Things sets up the antagonist, the Demogorgon, and the Upside Down as the main idea and threat of the show, along with characters like Eleven and the whole gang. And the whole arc of the first season is wrapped up by the end. The Demogorgon is defeated, and the world seemingly goes back to normal after that. There are some minor scenes towards the very end that hint at something more going on, but nothing is enough to set up something that needed to be paid off in a later season. In other words, the show is concluded by the end of the first season, so why continue? It is a completed story with a definitive beginning, middle, and end. It has mystery, it has a serious threat as we're not so familiar with it has a weird idea, it's a story that is capped off by the end of the first season. Regardless of how good the second, third, fourth, and probably fifth season of the show are, I strongly believe that the perfect end for this show is after season 1. There is nowhere else for the story to go, and we can see this through the antagonists. The later seasons make the Russians a huge threat when, to my knowledge, they weren't in the first season at all. Also, the main threats are imitations of the Demogorgon while not being the same. So in other words, the creators are making new things that aren't connected to the main original original story. The Russians being the biggest example of the show trying to create something cool while feeling tonally and plot-wise completely separate from season 1. And I'm not saying every season has to be tonally the same as the original seasons, but for a show like this, it definitely should be. Now, I think you all know why the show continued, because it absolutely popped off. Everyone was watching this show and it gained massive popularity. But for the purposes of the story and the argument of when the show should have ended, the perfect ending is after season 1. There's nowhere else to go in that story. And again, every show I'm giving here are examples of a bigger idea that I'll get to at the end. I'm not saying that this show shouldn't have 4 more seasons, but this show does present an interesting idea and is one of the best examples of when to end a show. But first, I want to talk about another example. Oh, Gravity Falls, it is good to be back. Gravity Falls is a wildly popular Disney show that is a great example of a show that ended when it needed to despite fan outcry. The show's first season is very episodic. You can watch the 15th episode without watching any other. Not the best viewing experience, but you can watch the first season in a random order theoretically. But there are major overarching storylines that are set up in the first season. The biggest being the journal, and more importantly, the mystery of who wrote it. This is actually set up in episode 1 of the show, but isn't paid off until episode 11 of season 2. And this is probably the biggest plot point of the show and is a huge part of the plot. The first season actually doesn't focus on it as much. A few references and hints are thrown out, but there aren't any major episodes revolving around it. So the first season and the finale, Gideon Rises, is not a definitive end to the show as a whole. Yes, the season finale sees the defeat of Gideon, the season's main antagonist, but the final scene sets up a main storyline of the second season, the portal bringing the author back to Gravity Falls. But the interesting thing is that this reveal was not made up in the final episode as a potential tease to season 2, as say the worm thing in Stranger Things. This was set up relatively unknowingly in episode 1 of the series and is further set up in episode 19 of season 1. So this was a major player in season 1, it was just less known and more in the background. The second season, however, is where the show picks it up big time. Episodes centered around who the author is and the secret portal, side conversations about it, major revelations. It's majorly important to the second season without feeling like a new plot point. It was set up and hinted at in the first season, it just wasn't given as much focus as we were still getting used to the characters and the environment of the show. So the show needed to continue in order to flesh out and complete that plot point. If the show ended at season 1, all the setup and intrigue of the author, the portal, Bill, etc. would be wasted. The story as a whole needed a definitive conclusion to all of these plot points. And once the author is revealed and Weirdmageddon is extinguished, thus ending all of these story points, the show is over. And that's really interesting because Gravity Falls could have definitely pulled the Simpsons. Just keep making seasons and episodes with different and fun mysteries and jokes, create some new overarching plot points, and you've got 5 or 6 more seasons of this. But they didn't. Were there things set up that could be used to justify a season 3 or 4? Absolutely. The final note and conversations had by the characters could be used in a way to justify that. But in the words of Alex Hirsch, the creator of Gravity Falls,
I knew once we know who wrote the journals, there's not a lot of show left. So I'm going to design it so that as soon as we discover that answer, it's a ticking time bomb till the end of the series. Because without that tension, it's something interesting, but it's not Gravity Falls anymore.
The show could keep going, as I said, but the story is done, so why push it? Gravity Falls only has 2 seasons, the relatively fun and goofy first half and the deeper, story-rich second half. And is there anything else we need? The story is done by the second season, and if a third season was made, entirely new plot points would have to be made in order to structure that new season. So ending at season 2 was the correct option. Now, the final example of a show I'm going to talk about in this video is a little indie show that I actually don't think a lot of people have heard of, The Walking Dead. Now, jokes aside, The Walking Dead has 11 seasons, so to say it was popular would be an understatement. But where it fits in this video is the fact that this show keeps going on for so long. The Walking Dead is a prime example of a show staying on air for an unnecessary prolonged amount of time. The show, based around The Walking Dead comics, follows Rick Grimes and his gang of buddies and their journey through a zombie apocalypse. The first couple of seasons mainly revolve around survival, especially the first season in which the world is new and unexplained. Then towards the middle and end of the show, it mainly starts to focus on villains and opposing groups. The Governor, the Wolves, Negan, Alpha are all main villains that the characters need to overcome, usually taking a whole season or 2 to defeat. And this is where the problems for the show start to rear their ugly head. The main focus of the show starts to get repetitive. A bad guy is introduced, so we have to stop them. them. Another bad guy is introduced in their wake, we need to stop them. Rinse and repeat until the 11th season. And again, I'm not saying that these are bad, but it does create a problem for the show's story as a whole. There isn't so much of a connector between seasons, and it feels clunky. Time jumps are often used between seasons just to spice things up with new character relationships and locations, and even when they're not used, it feels disconnected, giving the show a stunted overall plot. Regardless of how good of a villain Negan is, I've talked about that for a while, the seasons still feel disconnected, especially when a villain is set up to be a big threat and is dealt with relatively quickly. This is also forgetting that The Walking Dead is a drama, not necessarily an action show. The focus is on the characters, but that does not fix the plot problems at play here. There are major issues with how the show is structured, and that leads to a weird feeling when the show actually does end. So when should the show have ended? After season 1? After Negan is dealt with? Or the biggest one, when Rick leaves the show? A big problem many people, even big fans of the show, have with The Walking Dead is that the show continues way after the main character essentially died. Have shows done this in the past? Oh, sure they have. But The Walking Dead is the story of Rick Grimes. He is the focus, and he has been throughout the entire show. An argument can be made that Daryl, Glenn, Maggie, or any of the season 1/2 crew is also a main character, but they aren't the main character that the show is hinging on. I would give it more thought if Judith or Carl became the main focus after Rick left, as they are still Grimes' children. But Carl dies before Rick leaves, and Judith is not made a main focus of the show after the fact. So should the show have ended when Andrew Lincoln left? Well, where it's put in the story also messes with that a bit. Rick's death, to put it frankly, comes out of absolutely nowhere. There's light setup that season, but nothing overarching throughout the show. Also, it happens during the middle of the season, so I don't know if I think it should have ended at that moment per se, but maybe the show could have tweaked it a bit to put it in a better place with better setup. In the actual ending of the show is a really poor place to end things. As stated, one of the best times for a show to end is when everything's been paid off, and The Walking Dead sets up a bunch of stuff in the final couple episodes, mainly to tease the spin-offs, and you do not want to end a show with a bunch of unnecessary loose ends. Are the final seasons of Walking Dead good? Sure, but looking outside of the quality, the show should not have kept going without Rick, or should have ended in a better way. So after looking at a few examples, when should a show end? Well, as we've looked at with these few shows, a show should end when the story has nowhere else to go. As shown with Breaking Bad, many things were set up that the story needed to pay off. So while new antagonists and characters were added in the final seasons, that stuff fits because the main story is not finished until Felina. Stranger Things had a solid open and shut story when looking at the first season. Things can be added and characters can be changed, but the story is finished after the first season, and subsequent seasons can feel very disconnected from the first in terms of tone and threats because of this. The Simpsons being entirely episodic doesn't necessarily need a definitive end because there are no major plot points that need to be paid off, so the story technically never needs a final episode. And that can be said about a lot of comedies and sitcoms. The Walking Dead's original main plot points were the survival of the group and Rick Grimes' development as a character. Once those plot points are done, or to a point where there's not much to do other than create completely new stories and plot points, the show should have ended. Are there things that can be added? Absolutely. The show loves to pull out random villains or new locations once the new season starts because there has to be a threat and overall plot point. But if you need to create entirely new plot points that form the mass majority of a season, that's a telltale sign of a show overstaying its welcome. In a broader sense that applies to the mass majority of shows out there, a show that has an overarching story should end once the overarching plot points are done. Because once they're done, the necessary thing the writers need to do is invent new plot points. Instead of a story continuing naturally from one season to another, each season is its own thing relatively unconnected from an original central story. And yes, a good writer can create new storylines that weave the two seasons correctly. However, the majority of shows can feel disconnected and cannot flow well between one season to another. So instead of a story continuing naturally from one season to another, each season is its own thing relatively unconnected from the original central story. Regardless of how good the individual seasons, characters, stories, villains are, the show should end before it gets to that point. The most important thing for any series is to avoid jumping the shark. End when the story is over and don't keep going into unnecessary cash grab seasons. But if you heard all of that and are still with me and are thinking, Who cares? I like seeing characters come back and have to be in new situations, fighting new things, cause why not? That's the point of a sequel season after all, right? So why am I bashing that? If you like that, that's fine. I personally find great enjoyment out of shows that keep going because it can be fun. But from an outside perspective, why should a show continue if there is literally nowhere else for the story to go that's already been set up? Once the story has exhausted all of its central plot points, the story should definitively end. I hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it. Subscribe if you want. God bless. Have a great day, friends.